Hey everybody, thanks for being here today. My name is Kelly Mack. I'm on the team here at Workbench, and for those who are unfamiliar with Workbench, we are an early stage enterprise fund based in New York City, and we invest nationally in areas of data analytics, infrastructure, security, and future of work. So if you're a startup building in the space, please reach out, as well as if you're a corporate looking into these areas, please reach out as well. And today, we have a webinar on conquering SOC 2 compliance, which we know from our own portfolio companies is one of the most challenging things to go through, especially when you're working with the enterprise. And today, I have Paul Valente from VISO Trust here with me today to talk a little bit about his own experience being on both sides of the table. And to start, would love to pass it on to Paul to just give a quick introduction. So Paul, if you can quickly tell us who you are, where you're from, and then also in true Workbench fashion, would love to start with a little icebreaker to keep it fun. And the icebreaker today will be something about you that's not on your LinkedIn.
Great, Kelly. Well, thank you, Kelly. I'm really excited to be here. So Paul Valente, CEO and co-founder of VISO Trust. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. Originally, I live there again now. And the fun fact here is I'm a musician also. I think that actually is on my LinkedIn profile, but what isn't, and dawned on me recently, is that I've been working on the same 7 minutes of music for over 20 years.
Do you have a SoundCloud or something that we can link to after this?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I really should, but I don't. Yeah. So watch my LinkedIn profile. I'll get one of those on there. I think I really should.
We'll be sure to update the attendees with that SoundCloud link when it does come out, because we need to hear the 7 minutes of music at some point.
Okay, cool.
Well, thanks again so much for being here today. As I mentioned before, you're on both sides of the table when it comes to SOC 2. Would love for you to explain, first of all, to the audience, how did you get to where you are? Why were you on both sides of the table? Give us a little bit about your background in the security ecosystem.
Yeah. So I'm a 20-year plus technologist. I got to start really serendipitously as a kid working as a technology consultant. I spent some time also teaching college, teaching computer science and security. I got really into security and committed to security working for city government. And from there, I've been fortunate to have a really exciting security career in security leadership. And I've led security programs and been chief information security officer at a company that is now Blackbaud, Restoration Hardware, Lending Club, ASAP, and really delighted to be with you here as CEO and co-founder of VISO Trust.
And tell us more about VISO Trust. That's a great time to plug in what you're working on.
Yeah, so foundational to the kind of the purpose of SOC 2 and something that is just increasingly important in technology today is trust. More and more companies are outsourcing more and more. Companies are closer and closer to having 100% technology footprint being owned by third parties, and really central to that is establishing trust. And part of that is vetting the security and monitoring the security of your vendors. And that's really where VISO Trust comes in. As many of you may know, that can be a very painful and difficult process. It can really constrain a company in terms of speed and innovation. And we essentially make that effortless and make the ability to establish and maintain trust a win rather than a shortcoming.
Awesome. And so before starting VISO Trust, you worked at a company called ASAP, which was a well-funded AI company based also in New York City that sells to large telecommunications companies and financial services companies. And you came in as their first chief information security officer. And part of your role was to obviously build a security program, but then also sell that security program so that your customers feel comfortable doing business with you. Part of that effort is getting a SOC 2 audit compliance certification. Can you tell us a little bit more about, well, what is SOC 2 for folks that have heard it for the first time, either from us or from the enterprise that they're working on. They're like, oh, what's a SOC 2? I have to get one before we start working together. And then tell us a little bit more about what SOC 2 helps companies, why exactly enterprise companies should get a SOC 2, or what benefit it provides.
Yeah, so SOC 2 is a standard that is put forth by the AICPA, and it essentially is a way for companies to demonstrate their assurance programs and essentially to show prospects and customers that they are a trustworthy enterprise and that they are going to manage risks appropriately and not put their customers really in a bad situation from a revenue risk, an operational risk, or a trust point of view. And the reasons that companies,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask the reason.
Yeah, so really the reasons for doing this are to essentially to appeal to new markets and to shorten the sales process. That's really why.
And why exactly does it help out with either market segment or the sales process? What is it about the certification that makes it easier?
Yeah, so essentially, if you're doing business with companies that value security, that value privacy, that value assurance, it's going to be important and it's going to help. Essentially, as you go kind of up market from wherever you are today, it's more likely to be more important. And then there's certain segments and verticals where it's highly important. So if you're working with sensitive data in any way, if you're interacting with financial services or healthcare or health tech or fintech or any of those market segments appeal to you, then it's gonna be a big win for you.
But do you need one in order to sell to a financial services or a healthcare company?
I would not say it's absolutely required, but in terms of your odds and how many companies are actually going to say yes to you, it can definitely it can definitely be a filtering point for them, and it can make a big difference.
And when you were at Lending Club as the Chief Information Security Officer there, as a financial services company, when you're looking at startups that either you use or the business uses, were they all required to have a SOC 2 audit? And if not, what were the occasions that it made sense that maybe they don't need a SOC 2 audit?
Yeah. So we definitely would look for a SOC 2 audit when looking at any company or prospective company. And if we were to be dealing with business stakeholders early in an RFP process, we would definitely give that to them as a term to filter on, definitely to look for companies where that's important. There could certainly be situations, where there isn't close integration with a vendor, or there isn't significant data exchange where it might not be required. But in general, for companies that are going to be touching anything sensitive, or where there's going to be any access to information, we would look for SOC 2, and we'd look for SOC 2 Type 2. And when companies did not have it, it isn't necessarily that they would be automatically excluded from doing business, but it would be a much harder process, a much deeper look, and a lot more resources for us and a lot more resources for our business stakeholders in terms of vetting those vendors, and in many cases really directly managing them. We'd have to be much more heavy-handed.
So in instances where, let's say, a marketing department is looking at a technology that will handle some sort of sensitive information of customers, and they're evaluating 5 products, if 2 of those products didn't have a SOC 2, would they automatically be left, cut from the evaluation process? And, what have you seen in your experience there?
Yes, yeah, and I've got great recent examples there. I was recently looking for, this was back at ASAP, we were looking at transcription vendors, and that was one of our hardline criteria, right? And you'd be surprised, how underdeveloped the transcription industry is in terms of security. So there was a lot of companies that were eliminated that way. And as for any of you that are at B2B companies, that are looking at this, one thing is that you won't necessarily know if you're being filtered because of that. We would essentially, folks would be looking at, a company's website. They'd go to /security. They'd look for SOC 2. It's not there. They close that tab, right? They go on to another vendor. So you may not even necessarily know that you're missing out on possible prospects.
Are there any equivalent standards that you might judge a startup by, whether it be ISO, or even if, let's say, a peer company of yours does use the product but doesn't have a certification? Does that have the same level of assurance that something like a SOC 2 would provide?
Yeah, great question. There's definitely standards that provide that can provide a similar level of assurance, and it's really about picking the one that's going to appeal to the industries and the market segments that you work with, right? If you're international, for instance, ISO is probably going to be more valuable to you than SOC 2 in terms of if you're appealing to an international market. SOC 2 is gaining traction internationally, especially in the UK, but it's historically been US focused. Certainly, if it's all about retail, you're going to have PCI, no matter what, right? And so there's certainly other standards that can provide a similar level of assurance, but there's none that is quite as broadly useful and broadly accepted in the US. And there really isn't any that is quite as flexible. There's ways that you can actually integrate your work around SOC 2 with these other standards and with and still appeal to those other markets. When you're early on in a company's development, you can't afford, either operationally or in terms of working with all the auditors, to do a ton of different audits. And SOC 2 is likely, in most cases, to be the one that gets you the most kind of broad traction. But there's certainly exceptions if you're really focused on a certain industry vertical.
That makes sense. And then lastly, really here, it seems like there are a lot of benefits to a SOC 2, but are there cases where it's actually not beneficial to complete a SOC 2?
Yes, I would say avoid a SOC 2. If your company just really is not at a point for whatever reason that it's committed to assurance, that it's committed to security and privacy, don't do it. Don't try and find the Saul Goodman of SOC 2 and get a SOC 2 when you're not really committed to that. Also, when companies just maybe they are committed, maybe they are trying to do the right thing by their customers and prospects and committed to assurance, but they're just not ready operationally. Operationally, it can be, I love the name Conquering SOC 2 because for this webinar, because SOC 2 is the source of pain, for so many people, going through difficult audits operationally. The last thing you want to do is subject your company, to a significant and heavy audit exercise when folks just don't have the time and you haven't been able to allocate the resources to do it. So don't do it if you're not ready. Don't do it if you're not committed. There are bad SOC reports out there, that have, controls that are obviously meaningless, or they have the wrong controls, or they leave, key products and service offerings out of the scope of the SOC 2. You can tell, as an experienced reviewer or auditor, that this was just a stamp, and you don't want one of those. It's better to actually have a real conversation about what you're trying to do and what you're building towards, and your commitment there, than to produce a bad or a misleading SOC 2.
I have a feeling that you have seen your fair share of horror stories in this domain.
Oh, absolutely. There's a zillion companies out there that say, oh, we're SOC 2, and then they send you, AWS's SOC report, right? And they've got some infrastructure in AWS, and they're doing that. There's lots of those kind of rubber stamps that I mentioned out there, where you take a look at the SOC 2 and there's really not much to it. And yeah, there's definitely horror stories for sure.
So you mentioned that in the cases where you're just not ready, SOC 2 doesn't make sense. But even when you are ready, if it's the first time that you're going through the process, it could be costly and be a huge burden. So how should an enterprise startup rationalize their control activities in order to reduce any of those costs or operational headaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you have something that you have to do already, like if you already have to be PCI, or you already have to be NIST because you're critical infrastructure, or you already have to do, you've got clients that are asking for high trust. Don't do this effort separately, right? The worst thing, and I've seen this many times operationally, where you have operational folks that are struggling to get through an audit. They finish up with their SOC 2 auditor and they say, whew, that's done. Now I can finally get back to work, right? And then, the next day they get an invite for the kickoff meeting for the PCI audit, right? That just kills your company. It slows you down. You want to rationalize first, you want to rationalize your controls, right? You don't want to have parallel kind of security and compliance programs, right? You want to rationalize your controls. It's really, really important. You want to pick controls that are practical for your business. You want to pick controls that achieve the business outcomes you want and that your customers want, that are important to your customers. And you want to architect those so that they fit, the multitude of standards that you might have to deal with. And then you kind of present them internally in a way that is simple and digestible, to your operational teams. And that's really, really important. So that kind of high level rationalization, super important. And then when it's time to actually do the audits, in many cases, you can combine the audits. Sometimes you can't combine the audits, but you can at least combine the evidence gathering, right? Evidence gathering is a lot of work, and you can do this once and essentially reuse that evidence for multiple audits. So that's really, really important to have a workable program that makes sense for people, and therefore is successful, and then to save costs operationally.
So when you were brought on to ASAP, did you have a team of security practitioners under you to help out with this process, or how did you engage with the rest of the business to make sure that yourselves internally that you could, just speed up that entire process?
Yeah. So the company had made some investments and had leveraged some third parties, which was great. There was a high level of awareness there, which was fantastic. It was and continues to be a company that has a great, fantastic security program. But in terms of internal focus, it did start out kind of just me, and it was important to build a team and to build awareness, and to, as we built a more robust program and kind of brought it to the next level, to spread that awareness around the country, around the company. So the really kind of a culture of security, a culture of assurance, understanding why it's important to customers, understanding why it's important to the strategic initiatives of the company are really, really important. That kind of culture, I think I can't remember exactly what it is right now, but people talk about just kind of in HR in general, kind of culture, trumping strategy, and it's the same really in security. Ultimately, it's your operational employees that give your program life, and it's that culture that you want to build and invest in that's going to be really the underpinning of everything that you do and going to make or break your success.
Because you were hired to ASAP, you were their chief information security officer, but many instances, a seed or Series A company, as they're trying to target the enterprise, don't necessarily have the headcount to just hire a security person. Do you have any recommendations for a 6-person engineering-led startup and how they can best go through this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. You do have to designate somebody as responsible internally, right? It could be the CTO, it could be a chief architect, it could be a variety of different people, and that person has to kind of put on the leader hat, make sure to spread the word and run to at least some degree the initiatives. It's also important to find, partners outside that can help, and in many cases, technologies that can help. Central to security programs at this point, especially given what we were talking about earlier and the nature of companies relying on third-party technologies, is companies like us. VISO Trust gives you the ability to put third-party security, which is central to a living security program at this point, really at the forefront of those processes, right? And you want to partner with a great audit firm, or one that is the appropriate for your approach, for your size, for your vertical, right? Companies that have had experience working with companies of your size at the stage you're at. You don't want to, if you're, a 30-person company, it's, probably not the best fit for like a Deloitte or a PwC or a, something like that. But the good news is that there's a ton of other reputable firms, and I know that there's some in the document that we've got for you here from Workbench, and there's others as well. So find one that's the right match with your stage and the right match with your approach, and that can be a great partner in helping you on this journey.
And that's a good point. We did just release a report on how to get through a SOC 2 audit that coincides with this webinar. So for those of you on the line that haven't had a chance to check it out, someone on our team will put it in the chat, and you should definitely take a look at it. So you've gone through the process of the SOC 2, type 1, type 2, and now you have your SOC 2. How do you leverage it for maximize success, whether that be new and existing customer conversations, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. So so you need to socialize it within your company. That's really, really important. Your marketing folks should know about it. They should understand it. They should have that deeper level of detail. Your salespeople should certainly understand it. You want it to be something that they are ready to talk about, ready to put in front of customers. And then it's kind of like a shout it from the rooftops with one caveat. You should definitely, SOC 2s, the auditors aren't going to let you kind of like just put the report out there, and there's some reasons why you probably wouldn't want to anyway. But you certainly should publicize the fact that you got through your SOC 2 or that you renewed your SOC 2. That should go out on your social media. Your SOC 2 status should definitely be a badge on your /security on your website. Like I was talking about before, folks are going to be kind of filtering you on that in terms of running their RFPs. So you want that out there, and you want to position yourself so that when your business stakeholder essentially has that first conversation internally with their risk person or their security person, that is part of that conversation, and that report like comes across right then and there in that conversation, like, oh, we're looking at this new vendor, their SOC 2, great, I'll email you the report, right? That's what you want that first conversation to be internally on the customer side between the business stakeholder and their risk person. That's going to give them a warm and fuzzy that it's going to change the whole interaction, after that. So it's really, really important to make it really prominent.
You got your SOC 2, you're publicizing your SOC 2. Is that the end of talking about security when going through the sales process?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think it's you're asking the wrong person for that. I'm super biased, of course. I want folks to talk about it all the time, but it's not. So SOC 2, for you, as a leader in your company, it's a tool for you also internally, right? It's a tool for you to kind of test and further understand and refine your own program. It's a test. It's a tool for you to obviously make that known, to folks. And I think that, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to make sure it's clear. You're going to want to make sure it's clear during the contract process. You're going to want to make sure it's clear. I already mentioned kind of up front. You're going to want to, essentially, a lot of companies that are in an early stage, they kind of shy away. They hope that nobody asks them about security and privacy and assurance. And this is going to change that. You're going to want to talk about it. You're going to have slides, about it in your sales decks, right? And even if folks, they say, oh yeah, next slide, right? The signal went out, right? I mean, and it makes a huge difference, right? It changes how people think. It changes, kind of how they evaluate risk in the sale, right? So we all know in sales, you're eliminating the risks of the deal. You're knocking out the reasons why not, and it's an important reason why not that can really change, what it's like to own your product for your business stakeholders, for your buyers, and it's kind of continuously important. It's something that you should kind of footnote everywhere.
Got it. And for the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to ask Paul here. I'm sure he'll be happy to talk about his experience on both sides of the table in case you're currently going through the process or if you're in the middle of it, or if you're just doing security review. Paul's seen lots of these, and so he can help out with the negotiation tactics there. And so Paul, we're not on the tail end of the pandemic. We are in it, so to speak. But has COVID changed what you've seen with regards to the process for SOC 2?
Yeah, that's interesting, Kelly. You should ask, and that's actually something funny. I mean, there's nothing funny about the COVID-19 or the devastation that it's caused, but this is essentially, it's always been kind of a pet peeve of mine that auditors are kind of they're really married to this concept of coming on site and this notion of the on-site audit, right? Mm-hmm. Many times I've asked auditors, hey, can we do this remotely? And nope, they have to come on site. And maybe in your companies, as you're selling to larger companies, you've perhaps seen that from customers as well. They have this kind of religious affiliation with coming on site. And that's actually finally changed. Now you're seeing audit firms actually advertising, we'll do your SOC 2 remote. And I mean, it's silly that it wasn't before. I've had folks fly across the country and had a receptionist, escort them to a little room and then plug them into a video conference with all the distributed teams that they need to talk to, right? After I had already tried to talk them out of coming, right? I mean, now, they're finally remote. I think that means that, maybe you've got more choices in terms of, audit firms and perhaps smaller ones that might have been operating a little bit more regionally before or would have been kind of priced out by the travel costs before. So you've got some more choice there. Happy to provide, recommendations based on the size there. And it should be, more efficient and should be less impactful on your operations, I think, overall. So it's a good time to get one if you don't have one.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point on. I mean, you mentioned that there are certain sizes that certain types of companies might make sense, whether it be Deloitte or others. And in your experience, what are those types of companies that you've interacted with that you found there is a good experience with and are specific to certain either type of company, size of company, et cetera?
Yeah, so I've worked with, with the big four, with all of them, and they all do great work, right? If you're at a large company or you're appealing to really, really large enterprises, that can, of course, be really useful. Down from there, there's kind of another tier, great companies like Coalfire, at that level. A great company that I've worked with in terms of, rationalizing, and that I know a lot of other people that I've worked with is Shellman. They do some great work across a number of standards, SOC 2, high trust PCI, et cetera. And then on the smaller side, there's a company in the Bay Area. They work nationally though, called Securacy, founded by a fellow by the name of Josh Damont, who had a great run at Dell SecureWorks prior. So he's a fantastic security and risk professional. And they appeal for, your first SOC 2. They're an excellent company for that. Yeah, I'll say those are some useful recommendations.
So you've had auditors come on site back in the day. Did you see any correlation with the type of refreshments that you had on the table there and the type of grade that they would give you at the end of the day?
You know, it's actually, you can never really understate, you know, the value of kind of entertaining folks and making them comfortable. You know, in terms of on-site auditors, I won't name anybody, but in terms of like really large financial institutions, you know, there's companies that have 100 people that are traveling, you know, around the country, and those people to do on-site audits, and they love it. They're basically tourists. If you can tell them, you know, what's great nearby, if you can give them, you know, nice meals, and you can always turn those into long conversations. You know, it's similar to boxing. You know, you can tire people out. You can lessen the amount of time they spend on asking you tough questions by talking about other interesting things. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of great tact.
Nice. And so we actually had a question come in. Do you think new compliance requirements will be added now that teams are distributed and security is changing?
Will there be new compliance requirements based on this? Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, the industry is well prepared. Those of us that are kind of, you know, forward thinking from a technology point of view, have been taking advantage of things like zero trust, and you know, we're in a good position for fully remote. But there's organizations that really weren't, and that have been where it's a big challenge, and they were really relying on kind of physical security or network boundary security before. And so you're going to see kind of zero trust principles definitely get more emphasis in the standards for sure. In terms of actual I'm sure that'll make its way into regulations as well. We haven't seen anything yet, but I'm sure it's going to happen. The good news though is that some regulations have been interpreted, and standards have been interpreted prior in ways that prohibited remote work. Well, that's off the table now, right?
Right.
So there's certainly an upside to it as well, right? There's things that, there's certain industries that have been really averse to remote work that have just kind of like, you know, will impose on your company contractual language, for instance, that is impossible to adhere to as a startup. That we should see that stop happening, I think.
How about changes in infrastructure patterns, cloud, Kubernetes, serverless, etc.? How does the impact of their introduction into enterprise environments change the way that a SOC 2 is done? Or a SOC 2 or compliance in general, how that will happen in the future?
Right. You know, one thing really, you know, kind of close to my heart there is that it continues to elevate third-party security, right? This is something that, you know, has been a significant part of programs, has really become central to programs at this point. You know, if essentially most of what's happening with technology, with data, you know, with information is happening across third parties, then your third-party cyber risk management program is absolutely central to showcasing your security. It should be central in your SOC 2 audit, and it should be a central part of your program. And that, you know, that's really what we're hearing every day, is how that's more important, you know, than it ever was.
And then I guess one other question that I had was, when you are an early stage startup and you might not have the resources to do a SOC 2 audit or like really dedicate the time to it, is it okay to not do it and not target certain industries and focus on others? And what has your experience been on the trade-offs between doing it and not doing it? And is there ever really a case to just, you know, push it off 2 or 3 years until like you're ready to service a really large enterprise client?
Yeah, I would say if you don't know exactly what vertical you should focus, you know, how much of your resources, a large portion of your resources on yet, then you probably shouldn't do it yet. The caveat there is if you know you're handling really sensitive data, then you're probably going to want to do it anyway. But if you're not, you know, if your data is kind of, you know, you don't have things like social security numbers, you know, you don't have health records, things like that, you might be able to postpone and wait till you really know exactly what that big target market is going to be for you, and make sure you do something that that is going to appeal to them in the way that's going to give you the most mileage there. And there's plenty of other ways to kind of demonstrate your security. Now, the downside is that they are potentially going to be more time consuming, in terms of the sales cycle. The caveat there, though, is if you're at a stage where your customer relationships are from, they were from your prior network, or you've got direct ins with CEOs, or or your buyers, the security team reports to your buyers, right? Sometimes you can have really good leverage in other ways. And so if that's where all your business is focused right now and going to be for the next 6 months or a year, then you can probably get by with that one.
Got it. And then outside of SOC 2, security review, maybe you've encountered this as a startup, but say you get what seems like an outrageous question about your security program. Are they in fact outrageous questions that are just, things that large companies just tend to ask, or is it something that you should actually be aware of and actually fix?
Well, if you're asked by a customer or prospect, you always want to give it some deep thought and analysis. But there are definitely questions out there you're going to get, and this is part of why we founded VISO Trust, right? This process of vetting security is so inefficient, right? And the process of questionnaires, which we eliminate, they really they can have so much back and forth. You get asked questions that your services are out of scope for, or the types of data that they reference, are out of scope, or they're asking for, an arcane way of approaching, a security problem, right? Something that's been long since automated or solved by one of your tools, right? So there's going to be a lot of that, and don't be afraid to push back. Don't be afraid to tell them what you do instead of what they're asking, right? And look for opportunities, to partner with companies like us to streamline that and speed that up.
Great. So with that, any last questions from the audience? Well, all right then. Paul, thank you so much for the time today. This has been super insightful, and appreciate you spending the time today. For those that are listening in, again, we wrote a complimentary blog post of this webinar that details going through your SOC 2 compliance audit, and be sure to check that out. Again, thanks for joining today, and hope to chat to you all again. Thanks again, Paul.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Workbench, and thanks everybody who attended. Take care.
Take care.